There is just one story this morning, the dramatic end of the Gorbachev era in the Soviet Union.
She was one of Britain's most high-profile television presenters, at the pinnacle of her career, when she was mercilessly gunned down outside her house in London. Her killer left the scene without a trace. The cold-blooded murder of Jill Dando sent shockwaves through the country. A nation grieved for the golden girl of TV. This was no ordinary crime. This was a crime that shook Britain. On the 26th of April 1999, BBC television presenter Jill Dando was shot by a single bullet to her head on the doorstep of her home in southwest London. The hunt for the murderer and his motive proved to be one of the largest, most difficult and expensive inquiries ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police. 2 years later, during a controversial court case, local resident Barry George was found guilty for the killing. But during a dramatic retrial, he was cleared of Jill Dando's murder. So who shot one of Britain's most best-loved television personalities? This is the story of the brutal slaying of Jill Dando, told from the inside through the eyewitness accounts from those closest to the story. Born in Weston-super-Mare, Jill Dando began her journalism career as a reporter on a local paper, the Western Mercury. Determined to work in broadcasting, she eventually went on to become a presenter for BBC South West. She quickly rose to become a household name when she moved to the BBC's national news operation in London, presenting the breakfast news and 6 o'clock news. But she was best known as the face of the hit shows Holiday and Crime Watch, a series which explored unsolved criminal investigations. Above all, Jill Dando was renowned for her down-to-earth charm that endeared her to millions of viewers.
It didn't matter whether she was doing Crime Watch or the news or the holiday programme and the other things she did. She had a warmth and sincerity about her, which is not really something you can learn. It's just the way you are. And I think Jill had that connection with the public that made them feel like she was their sister or their auntie and part of their family.
Jill Dando was a national figure. She was a very pleasant personality, very easygoing. Funnily enough, she self-deprecatingly once described herself as Miss Blando because she thought she was too nice to be true, but she was. People liked her.
When she moved to Fulham, she lived in the next road to where I live. And we would always bump into each other in the local shops, in the street, and that's how we would chat and catch up.
She was great fun, had a fabulous sense of humour, but very serious and professional when she needed to be, and she was just a great person to be around. Throughout certainly my years on Crime Watch, it was always a very close-knit team, and Jill fitted into that perfectly.
It was another young woman who was going to be the face of Britain at the millennium. So she was the embodiment, in a sense, of the BBC.
As well as enjoying a successful TV career, Jill had recently announced her engagement to gynecologist Dr. Alan Farthing.
She was getting married, she was talking about Alan and the wedding and getting excited about organising everything, and she had so much to look forward to, so much fun, happiness in her life.
I remember bumping into her when she came back from Sydney, when she'd been on holiday, and she was totally in love.
They had met on a blind date and were due to be married in September 1999. Jill talked eagerly about her desire to become a mother. She was happier than she had ever been. Jill Dando had spent the night at Alan Farthing's home in Chiswick.
this evening?
Jill left her fiancé's house in Chiswick. I think it was about 7 or 8 in the morning. The plan was that she would go from the house to, I think she had a fashion shoot at lunchtime, a job she was doing, and then in the afternoon she was planning to go to a fitting for her wedding dress.
Miss Dando had been going to her house purely to get changed. She was no longer living there. She was living with a boyfriend several miles away.
In Gowan Avenue was a 2-storey terraced house, which she was actually selling for about $400,000 at the time.
Jill lived on Gowan Avenue in Fulham, southwest London.
Gowan Avenue is almost a typical inner London suburban street. Terraced houses, most of the people are at work during the day and not too many people around at this time.
But it is an area with a lot of families with children out on the street walking, taking children to the park, taking them to and from school or shopping.
When she bought her home in Fulham and was so thrilled about it, she told me that one of the reasons she'd chosen that home was that it had a hedge and it had a tree that afforded her privacy.
Having left her fiancé's home in Chiswick, Jill made various stops on her way home, including a brief visit to the petrol station, King's Mall shopping centre in Hammersmith, and a fishmonger's on Fulham Road, before making her way home. It was around 11:30 a.m. when Jill finally arrived at Gowan Avenue.
She got out of her car, having parked it, and in fact still had the keys to the car in her hand.
As Jill was about to approach her front door, she was unaware that somebody was closely watching her every movement. The BBC's Golden Girl Jill Dando was the TV star everybody loved. She was full of excitement at her future plans to marry fiancé Dr. Alan Farthing and start a family. But these plans would never bear fruit. Jill arrived at her home on Gowan Avenue at around 11:30 a.m. As she looked for her house keys in her bag, she was approached from behind.
That morning I was working from home. I was going to go to the Munster Road to get some photocopies done. I walked up and suddenly realised that her car was parked. As I approached her home, I deliberately looked at her front door.
What it seemed to have happened was that Jill Dando had gone to her home address, albeit she wasn't living there anymore, and it would seem that she was attacked and shot effectively on a doorstep just prior to entering her house.
It was a ruthless murder. It wasn't done, the shooting wasn't from a distance. The killer wasn't standing at the gate, he wasn't sort of leaning out of a car, he went right up to her. Pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
There was no time to prepare. From one step to the next, everything changed. Because I was witness to an incredibly violent scene. At first it was difficult in the first few seconds to realise it was actually Jill, and she was actually in that position on her doorstep, leaning against her front door. She had changed colour. There was a lot of blood loss, and instinctively it was clear to me that she was dead.
The gate was firmly closed, and Helen knew it was important not to disturb the crime scene.
I looked around, there was nobody else in the street, and I quickly got my mobile phone to call the emergency services. When I was talking to the emergency services, I said that I thought that she had been stabbed because of the blood loss. It didn't occur to me at that point that it would have been a gun crime. And I added in the conversation, confidentially, it's Jill Dando.
Shocked and distressed, Helen didn't want to be alone.
I remember that I'd seen a neighbour who lives near me. So I ran down the road and knocked on the person's door. My neighbour came to the scene. She took one look and said, "She looks as if she's dead," and ran off further up the road to a doctor's surgery. So I was left on my own again at the scene looking at Jill, who was lifeless on her own doorstep.
The police were first to arrive.
They just went through the gate and started dealing with Jill.
There were mixed reports coming in. There was so much confusion, I think, by everybody because of the nature of the incident and, in reality, the nature of who she was.
They pretty quickly bundled me and the other two, the doctor's receptionist and my neighbour, into Jill's neighbour's home.
Soon after, the paramedics arrived, and then the air ambulance. Jill Dando was taken to Charing Cross Hospital.
She was certified dead at 1:03 p.m. The BBC television presenter Jill Dando has been murdered outside her London home.
A man was seen leaving from outside number 29 Gowan Avenue, and he ran east down this road towards the Fulham Palace Road.
Detectives are now trying to establish a motive for the murder. Our correspondent Fergus Walsh.
I felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
In this country, although there are a lot of shootings, they're usually linked to the underworld, crime gangs, teenage gangs. But a lady like this, shot on a doorstep in a West London street, a nice West London street, very respectable, quite well-heeled, was extraordinary.
The image that really is very, very difficult is her beautiful engagement ring with all that hope in it on a very dead hand, just snuffed out.
Scotland Yard launched into action with Operation Oxborough, the largest criminal investigation since the Yorkshire Ripper.
Regardless of who the victim is, there needs to be a methodical approach to the inquiry. It was just because of the victim, in this case, being such a high-profile celebrity, that everything was increased. For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
Also important to put this in some perspective, because the London police were on the alert searching for the now bomber, David Copeland. And so there was a huge amount of police activity around London and a lot of news media concentration on that issue, because there had already been two now bombs, one in Brick Lane, one in Brixton, and there was a great deal of concern about where this now bomber was going to strike again and what the reaction would be.
With unprecedented media attention surrounding Metropolitan Police investigations and the victim's high-profile status, the Homicide Squad were fully aware that they were under immense public scrutiny. They faced their first hurdle with a forensic examination of the crime scene.
Yeah, one of the main problems that the police had was that it had been quite severely compromised by the medical services that had been there, by them removing her body once it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done, created some problems. Very little was obtained from that scene. What they had done, I can't criticise that, because I assumed that everything was being done to try and save Miss Dando's life at the time.
There was nothing that came out from the scene other than the fact they, of course, had the bullet which had killed Jill Dando, which was quite unusual. It was crimped, it had been pressed in. They used 50 search officers going down the surrounding streets, and they took up the drains, they looked at the sewers, they looked all along the riverbank by the park in case that the government might just have tossed the gun over a hedge or threw it into a drain.
We can't be sure, obviously, about the gun that was used because it's never been recovered. But the thinking was that it was in some way a reactivated gun, or one that had in some way been adapted.
With a serious lack of forensics from the crime scene, the homicide squad turned their attention to examining the witness statements.
There was no eyewitness to the actual offence. Several witnesses gave information about a man who was present at the scene before and immediately after, and one of the main focuses of the inquiry was to identify this person.
Richard, her neighbour, said that he had heard her set her car alarm and that he had heard a scream, looked out of the window, and he'd seen somebody go past further down Gowan Avenue.
He walked very calmly away from the scene, and when I actually saw him, I thought nothing of it. I thought, in fact, it could have been a friend of Jill's when I heard the screaming. That's why I particularly at that moment didn't do anything that now I wish I could have done.
One of the problems that the team was faced with was the unprecedented amount of information that was being received within the incident room. During the course of the inquiry, over 2,000 people were named as being responsible or in some way involved in Miss Dando's murder. Without a clear witness or without a clear motive and reason, stranger murders are by definition the most difficult to investigate.
In a sad twist of fate, Scotland Yard turned to the programme Jill Dando presented before her death, Crime Watch, to help find her killer.
You never imagine in your wildest dreams the idea that you would ever have, or we would ever have had to make an appeal about somebody we knew so well. There was a pressure on us to think that we could do something to help, to use the programme and to use our experience to try and help in some way. And I think everyone was actually really relieved that they could feel they could do something. The appeal itself to find information regarding Jill's killer produced a lot of phone calls.
Several witnesses saw a man in the area earlier in the morning, and then there are various sightings of a man in a sort of waxed jacket. We have somebody who saw what they described as a sweating man at a bus stop. We have another sweating man seen in Fulham Palace Park, or Fulham Park, which is opposite, quite close to Gowan Avenue, who was talking on a mobile phone. So there are lots of different little sort of sightings, but nobody actually saw the attack.
One of the main purposes of the inquiry is to try and separate the potential suspect from other people.
And I think as the months went on, it was quite apparent that this was going to be a long investigation.
As the police persevered with their inquiry, thousands of mourners lined the streets to watch the 3-mile cortege. The funeral service of Jill Dando took place at Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare. A grieving nation mounted pressure on Operation Oxborough. Would the homicide squad ever find Jill's killer and bring him to justice?
So, if any of tonight's reconstructions have helped jog your memory...
BBC television presenter Jill Dando was the nation's sweetheart. But in April 1999, she was violently murdered with a single gunshot fired at close range to her head. Her killer fled the scene undetected. What followed was a lengthy and extensive inquiry, but the Metropolitan Police faced a serious lack of evidence. No murder weapon, no motive, and no eyewitness. They were facing mounting pressure from the country's press and public to bring Jill's killer to justice.
What we needed to be sure of, was she followed, wasn't she followed? There was a small and dedicated group of officers that meticulously went through every scrap of footage that we had during the course of the inquiry. What we can categorically say is that from the meticulous examination of the footage from 191 cameras, she wasn't followed at all to that address.
They also searched through 80,000 mobile phone records for the Fulham area and also for Chiswick, which could in some way be linked to her death. Either somebody following her who passed on a message that she was on her way home, or somebody who was waiting and got the message that she was arriving. None of those phone calls produced any evidence either.
The months rolled by, but no significant leads emerged. The police were struggling with a serious lack of evidence.
Her file of facts had 486 names in it, and they went through every name and address they could find. They looked at her fiance's background and drew a blank on that.
We obviously just stayed at my house.
I realised that on day one, I was probably on a list of potential suspects being first on the scene. That's a normal thing. The nearest and dearest of a victim are always scrutinised, and I knew that I would be too.
Because of the nature of who Miss Dando was and her work, it was hard to ascertain a definitive motive as to why someone would conceivably want to kill her.
Due to constant media attention, there was immense pressure to make an arrest, but they were fast exhausting all their leads. By now, Operation Oxborough decided to change tack. They were beginning to consider the possibility that Jill Dando's killer was a stalker with obsessive tendencies.
Like a lot of celebrities, she'd attracted a lot of unhealthy interest. They found, for example, that one man had tried to acquire her BT account and run it unknown to her, but which would allow him to look at her phone calls or phone numbers. They found that somebody else had 150 pictures on his, of her collected on his computer. Another man had attempted to take over her utility bills, electricity, gas, water. Extraordinary behaviour by some of these people. But the police looked at about 4,000 people, I think it was, of whom about 150 seemed to have what they would have described as an unhealthy interest in her. But at the end of the day, none of these had showed any evidence of taking their interest further than a fantasy or a fixation.
As the investigation reached its first anniversary, detectives decided to re-examine the early information they received soon after the shooting to see if there was anything they missed. Amongst other names, a man who lived half a mile from Jill's house was brought to their attention. Barry Michael George.
George had a conviction for a sex attack in the 1980s. He also discovered that there was a reference on his file to the fact he'd been arrested in the grounds of one of the royal palaces with a length of rope around his shoulder and a knife. And the palace concern was the one where the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana were then living. And they found that he'd been stopped by police in the 1990s for following women. Nobody at Fulham police station actually knew anything about him, interestingly. Barry George turned out to be a very long way down the suspect list.
He was described as a loner. And he was almost a usual, one of the usual suspects, because the police hadn't found anybody and they came back to him.
Barry George had been reported to the police in the early days following Jill's murder.
A detective constable called John Gallagher discovered a message about a man called Busara, which had come in from Hafad, which was a local drop-in centre for disabled people, very close to the scene of the shooting, in which they said that this man Busara had seemed very agitated and they were concerned about him. The policeman did some checking and found that Busara cross-referred to Barry George.
Barry George often claimed he was the cousin of British musician Freddie Mercury, using the alias Barry Balsara.
To some extent, he was living in a fantasy world, especially in relation to Queen and music and all the rest of it. But this is it. It was an overtly fantastical world where, he wasn't hiding away.
He also took the name Paul Gadd, which was Gary Glitter's real name. He also used the name Steve Powers, who was an SAS soldier who took part in the Iranian embassy siege. And he also used the name Lee Majors, who was a stuntman and Hollywood star at one stage. And he was actually convicted for several offences under some of these aliases, bizarrely. But it's just an example of the sort of fantasy life he led. And for the police at the time that they were looking at him as a strong suspect, that all added to the mix.
I think most people who lived in Fulham were aware of Barry George wandering around the streets. He's quite distinctive. He was somebody who probably needed a little bit more help than he had in the community.
But further investigations into police records during the early days of their inquiry revealed more.
By now, police were getting very concerned because they also knew, looking through their records, that a local taxi firm had also called the police soon after the shooting to say they were concerned about a man who kept coming in and seemed to be trying to build up what, as it appeared to the police, to be constructing an alibi for himself.
Timings were crucial, of course, because the killing took place at around 11:30 in the morning. Question, where was he? And his case was that he'd attended at a local agency, Hafad, housing agency, and that he'd gone home and changed clothing, and he'd gone to a park and gone to get a taxi somewhere else. And so his defensive alibi was that he wasn't in the road when it happened.
Detectives decided to place him under surveillance and carefully monitored his every move.
We had access to a whole load of black and white photographs taken of him in the street. My recollection is that those photographs didn't take it anywhere. In other words, yes, he's looking a bit furtive in the street, because he always looks a bit furtive.
The investigation revealed that Barry George had a history of following and photographing women.
There was one case of, I think it was a woman in a bus queue, and then he got on the bus with her. Now, this is very overt behaviour. In other words, it is somebody who is, I think, desperately anxious to create a relationship, which he hasn't got, with somebody. And so it's an unhappy situation, and it's very unpleasant, I suspect, for any woman who is on the receiving end of this treatment. And in a sense, he needs help if that's what was going on. But this is a long way away from the nature of this crime, which wasn't about following Jill Dando around in order to create a relationship.
The psychological profilers were talking about somebody who might well fantasize, who might, for example, have fantasized over Princess Diana, somebody who'd had difficult relationships in the past, which Barry George had. All of these things added to the list of things that ticked off that made him a very strong suspect, and then eventually the strongest suspect.
Over a year after Jill's murder, and based on their findings, Met Police were confident there was sufficient evidence to arrest Barry George.
4 unarmed officers, or that is what Scotland Yard still maintains, arrested him, and they began a search of his home. And that is when things became interesting.
Okay, we'll start the search. Barry George's flat was absolutely stacked to the ceiling with old newspapers. You could barely get in it. So he, again, might be regarded as an oddball for keeping all these newspaper cuttings and so on. So, yes, there was a sort of obsessive side to this man because he collected things, but I know there's people who collect things. Maybe not to that extent. Obsessive of Jill Dando? Absolutely not. You know, you would think that if he was obsessed with Jill Dando, he would have accumulated quite a library, because she was in the newspapers very regularly. None of it was cut out, none of it was highlighted. There were no notes anywhere suggesting he was wanting to find out where Jill Dando was at any one time.
Detectives removed various items.
They took a coat that he'd worn and sent it for examination. They developed about 100 reels of film which he had, which showed that he'd been stalking around about, I think it's 480 women.
Police investigation also revealed that he had an interest in firearms. Barry George was interviewed at Hammersmith Police Station in London.
This is a man who originally had told the police that he had nothing to do with guns and hadn't had anything to do with guns for quite a long time. But police found that, for example, he tried to join the parachute regiment, the TA section of it. He tried to join the regular army. He belonged for a short time to a gun club in Kensington. He'd had a number of starter pistols. A former neighbour of his had seen him with a weapon.
After he was arrested, it was plain he did have an interest in firearms. I mean, he didn't have the weapon that is said to have been used here, but he did have an interest in weapons. But that doesn't mean that he's the murderer.
He said he had nothing to do with Jill Dando. He didn't know Jill Dando lived in the area. He'd never met her, never seen her, and denied any link at all to the murder.
Barry George was asked to take part in an ID parade.
He refused to go on an ID parade, and so the ID parades were done on a laptop with potential witnesses being shown a series of images of possible suspects plus innocent people, and picking them out from a laptop display.
There was a neighbour living right next door to Jill Dando who was looking out on the road, and a man living opposite. They both saw somebody departing from the gate area where this had happened. And they both went to identification parades, and neither of them picked out Barry George. In fact, either one or both picked out someone else.
Whilst Barry George was being held in custody, forensics made an interesting discovery.
Everything gelled for the police when they were told by the forensic science experts that they had found a very, very tiny trace of firearms discharge in the pocket of the coat that had been taken away. It was said to measure around about 0.5 of an inch. It was tiny. But the interesting thing about it was that the chemical composition, according to the scientists, was exactly the same as the bullet which had killed Jill Dando.
They also found a single fibre at the crime scene that matched the material of a pair of trousers owned by prime suspect Barry George. On the 29th of May 2000, Barry George was formally charged for the murder. Were Metropolitan Police finally going to get justice for Jill? The murder inquiry into BBC TV presenter Jill Dando's death was fast becoming one of the largest and most expensive police investigations to ever take place in Britain. Operation Oxborough traced, interviewed and eliminated thousands of suspects in the months following Jill's death. A year later, local resident Barry George emerged as a prime suspect. Following closer inspection into his criminal history and police surveillance, they arrested him. It was during a raid on his flat that some of his personal possessions were removed and examined. When forensics revealed a small amount of gunpowder trace in his coat pocket and a thread from his trousers linking him to the crime scene, the homicide squad formally charged Barry George with the murder of Jill Dando.
Barry George's arrest had incited quite a lot of actually adverse publicity, which I think was very, very unfortunate. The public were sympathetic to a very famous, very intelligent, very beautiful woman who'd been killed at her front doorstep. And so there's an outpouring of grief, and therefore anyone who's arrested for that immediately has a problem.
Almost 1 year after his arrest, the trial for the murder of Jill Dando finally took place at the Old Bailey. It was a trial that would captivate the nation and prove to be one of the most controversial cases in British criminal history. Barry George pleaded not guilty.
A trial at the Old Bailey for anyone is a pressured event, especially if it's in one of the old courts, which it was, because they've held many famous trials. Certainly most of the UK press and media were there on a daily basis. So the court was full of people interested in the result.
It's a very dramatic trial. He sat throughout it in the dock with a psychiatrist because he was concerned about his ability to follow the case.
He suffered from very, very serious epilepsy, difficulties about concentration and so on. So this made communication a very sensitive area.
During the trial, the prosecution presented George as a lone gunman with stalker tendencies. But his defence counsel painted a different picture.
Was it an assassination?
We tried to present Barry George, obviously as the person that he was, just a very vulnerable person, living in the locality, relatively well known in the locality, who had an alibi, which he'd obviously produced to the jury, and basically as somebody who, in a sense, wasn't capable of carrying out this murder.
The case against Barry George centred on forensic findings.
The gun residue was clearly the key issue because it linked, according to the prosecution, it directly linked Barry George to a gun, to the murder.
As far as we were concerned, our experts said that one particle doesn't add up to even a row of beans. It means nothing forensically. We also examined very, very carefully the possibility of contamination at the laboratory, because one particle can be airborne, one particle can go from one surface to another surface, to a hand, to somewhere else. And we examined very carefully whether, in fact, at any time, the particle hadn't been in the pocket but had got into the pocket through a process of contamination. You have to remember, no firearms residue was found in his flat or found in anything else to do with him. So if he's supposed to be adapting weapons or playing around with weapons, where was he doing it? He certainly wasn't doing it in his flat. He didn't own lots of flats all over London. One had to examine the possibility that it had got there through an accident of continuity. In other words, it was contamination.
The prosecution relied heavily on the identification evidence. They relied on a fibre which they found, which they said linked Barry George's trouser to Jill Dando, that the fibre had come off the trousers and onto her clothing.
The case hung on the slenderest thread, that was the sort of comparison, and the slenderest thread was this one particle. Because the identification evidence of him being in the street 2 hours before, in my view, was weak. An identification is reputedly very risky. So what else is there? So the fibres in the case were going nowhere.
George's defence team were putting forward a strong case.
This case depended largely on circumstantial evidence. And plainly, from a prosecution point of view, forensic scientific evidence can be rather more compelling than any other.
It was circumstantial, and they admitted it was circumstantial, but the judge and the prosecution both said that it was possible to convict on the basis of circumstantial evidence without, for example, a confession, without an eyewitness who had actually seen a gun used, without the gun itself, without a motive.
The jury retired to deliberate. 5 days later, they had finally reached a verdict.
Foreman of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, my lord.
A jury of 6 women and 5 men found Barry George guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
It was a shock. Obviously for Barry George, but a shock for all of the defence team, and I dare say others in court who had believed, as I had, that this wasn't going to lead to a conviction.
For the majority, it was a simple case of a mentally ill man, or a man who was clearly not in his right senses, infatuated, fantasised, had approached Jill Dando. She had rebuffed him. He had killed her. That's the way it came across in a lot of newspapers and the media generally.
I was very upset. I was very angry, the fact that he'd been convicted. I had plenty of time to think back over the trial and say, well, what's gone wrong here? How did this jury come to that conclusion? I think it's probably a combination of somebody who kind of looked odd in the dock, somebody who looked odd, which fitted the publicity that had gone before. Secondly, I think there was pressure on this jury, feeling that the nature of the crime was so heinous that, here was an odd man and he lived in the area, and there was a firearms particle, and they put that together, I think.
Barry George always protested his innocence, but as he started his life sentence, there was unease at the verdict.
From that point on, people began to get behind Barry George, to campaign for a fresh look at the case, and arguing that there was something wrong here, that it was a miscarriage of justice. His defence managed to mount an appeal. As the years went on and Barry George remained in prison, a campaign built up to get him free.
After an appeal and 8 years in jail, vital new forensic research cast doubt over the significance of the gunpowder traces.
The Court of Appeal had argued that if the evidence in the pocket had been found a day or so after the murder, then it was key evidence. There was a link. But because there had been such a long period of time, it was no longer safe to assume it was linked to the murder. There were also points made about the fibre which was found on Jill Dando. The clothing she'd been wearing had been left at the scene for quite a long time after the shooting. So it's perfectly possible for that fibre, which is fairly common, to have come from another source and not from Barry George's trousers.
The forensic evidence was deemed unsafe. The Court of Appeal set a date for the retrial.
The prosecution maintained that he was an obsessionist with a fantasy about guns and a grudge against the BBC. The defence simply said, what we have here is the police have arrested the local nutter. And that was the phrase used by William Clegg QC, who now appeared for Barry George. And the jury accepted that there wasn't sufficient evidence.
After 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally cleared of the murder of Jill Dando.
Because I'm a firm believer that the truth will out in the end and justice will be done, but some people have to wait far longer than he did. And to give him his due, his persistence, his self-belief, that got him acquitted.
So who did kill Jill Dando?
There wasn't a clear explanation. It wasn't a sex attack, it wasn't a robbery. It was an assassination of some description, and that left people very, very puzzled.
I mean, I believed throughout the case, because of the nature of the evidence and the window of opportunity, it had to have been carried out by a professional.
What we were all conscious of throughout the inquiry was what a senseless crime this was. And the feeling of shock, to a degree, throughout the country never really diminished.
It was just extraordinary, and please God, nothing ever like this happens again.
On the morning of March the 13th, 1996, the city of Dunblane in Scotland was changed forever.
A middle-aged loner fixated on youngsters, guns and his own grievances
killed 16 children and their teacher.
And then committed suicide.
That will go down in history as one of the worst massacres ever.
Nobody had planned for anything like this in Dunblane.
There's just so many people crying and panicked.
16 children and their teacher were brutally shot and murdered at Dunblane Primary School before the perpetrator turned the gun on himself.
The lasting image for me would be being in among the crowd of frantic parents. Life changed completely and forever for these people, and I was a part of that, and it's something you never forget.
A senseless crime so devastating it sent shockwaves across the world as people reeled with the loss and called for urgent changes in gun laws, making this a crime that shook Britain.
I can't get the images out of my head yet, and I think that will take some time. It was an appalling mess. Evil visited us yesterday, and we don't know why. We don't understand it, and I guess we never will.
In 1996, Thomas Hamilton stormed into a local primary school and opened fire. In an unprovoked attack, a class were targeted with horrific consequences. In this programme, we tell the inside story through the eyes of the parents and professionals at the centre of the tragedy.
What train, Gary?
Charlotte was our first child, obviously a joy to us. We'd been married 5 years before we decided to have a family, so she was a little girl.
Sophie was, I'm sure, a very typical 5-year-old girl, full of life, bubbly. I found her a joy to be with. We could have intelligent conversations together.
She grew up. As the years went on, she was a tomboy. She liked climbing the trees and rolling in the garden. She was, life and soul of the house, and she had a brother all of a sudden to start beating up as well. And she was bright, and she was intelligent and a good person.
We had a very intimate family life. Sophie's mum had died 2.5 years beforehand, so we spent a lot of time in each other's company. We had our own sort of routine way of doing things. Sophie became a companion as well as a daughter, because we did go to so many places together. She was with me much of the time.
Morning, Dad. Morning. What would you like for breakfast this morning?
We had breakfast together. Sophie had Cocoa Pops.
And what have you got at school today? Science.
On the morning of the 13th of March, Mick and his daughter Sophie got ready for the day ahead.
Come on, let's get this jumper on. Here we go. Ready?
We got up somewhere between 7 and 7:30. I made sure that Sophie got dressed.
Okay, let's go. Good girl.
Across town, Martin Dunn and his family were starting their day.
We were planning to move away from Scotland because of job movements. So although we'd only been here a very short time, we were going to be moving south within the month.
Have you got your keys?
So at that time, I was not so rushed to go in and out of work. It was a normal morning. It was breakfast time. Charlotte loved going to school, so there was not a problem of saying, come on, get ready. She was up and ready, she was bubbly. She loved her breakfast, so we all had breakfast.
Charlotte Dunn and Sophie North both attended Dunblane Primary School. They had started in the lower class 7 months earlier.
She packed her belongings all in a bag. She just went to school with a smile, as she did every day, really.
See you tonight then, honey.
Hi.
Take care, honey.
I took Sophie to Kids Club, where she went before and after school. Sophie would be at Kids Club for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour before school started, and would go over to her classroom at around 9 o'clock.
Bye, Dad.
In fact, I was never quite sure of the timings of things to do with the school. My duties were to drop her off at Kids Club and pick her up from Kids Club. So the bit in between was a bit of a mystery sometimes.
I actually took Charlotte to school on that morning, so dropped her off at school, stood with her until the bell rang, playing with her friends and introducing me to some of the other children who I'd probably not seen before. So that was quite different for me, because I hadn't done that normally.
This is my dad. Hello.
We looked at where we wanted to live when we took the decision to move to Scotland. Dunblane had a good reputation for schools, which was a big decision for ourselves, that we wanted the right school for Charlotte. It was a sleepy village compared to a sprawling industrial Midlands that we came from, so it was novel for us.
With Sophie and Charlotte at school, Mick and Martin went to work.
I drove from Dunblane after I'd dropped Sophie off to go to Stirling University, where I worked, and spent a couple of hours doing the usual things I would do at work, mostly based in my office.
I was working in Stirling at the time, so it was just a normal day in the office. Approximately 10 o'clock, we had a phone call from one of our sites, some guys saying, have you heard the news?
After I'd been at work for 2 hours, a colleague came to my office door and asked if I'd heard anything about a shooting at Dunblane High School.
What's happened?
He then corrected himself and said primary school. He'd had a phone call from one of our students. He'd heard on the radio about a shooting.
He says, oh, there's been an incident in Dunblane, there's been a shooting, it's on the news.
A shooting at a school was difficult to comprehend. With limited details, the fathers began searching for more information.
Unfortunately, I was the first one to take this message, so having finished the phone call with Mike, I put the phone down and went and got the other parents and said, look, I've been told there's something happening in Dunblane. We need to find out.
Hello, is that Dunblane School?
One of the guys picked up the phone, rang the school, managed to get through, and we were just told that yes, there'd been an incident. Could you please come to the school and fetch your children?
I tried calling Dunblane Police Office, couldn't get any answer. So there was no information apart from these rumours.
We don't know if Sophie's involved.
I remember just a typical news day with the TVs on, and then telephone started to ring and people were saying something's happened at Dunblane, there's been a shooting at a primary. Nobody was really sure of what was going on. And more telephones rang and reporters were assigned to start phoning people. I just remember there was a little bit of confusion, but like tension and worry building up, because you kind of knew there was some kind of drama unfolding anyway. Somebody was saying kids have been shot.
The residents of Dunblane have been stunned by horrific news. Initial reports claim of a shooting in the local primary school, but information was limited. Only 2 hours earlier, Mick North had dropped his 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, off for her classes. Martin Dunn had said goodbye to his daughter, Charlotte, in the school playground. After hearing of the incident, they desperately try to find out exactly what has happened.
I got back towards Dunblane and it was chaos. I mean, the roads were jammed. I ended up parking on the local Tesco's car park, made my way up to the school on foot. There was lines of police officers there asking who your child was, what year she was in, and people were then being sent one way or another.
I didn't really panic at that time. I was obviously worried and concerned, but no one had any information. And I waited until somebody else came along and asked if I would like to have a lift back to Dunblane. And I said, yes, I probably should go.
So if there's trouble, we're going over there, come on.
Immediately we were dispatched a team of reporters. And we had the features editor of the Record, Alan Rennie. He had 2 kids at Dunblane. He was from Dunblane. So he was obviously immediately, the whole office was turned out. Nobody knows who's been shot, whether it's teachers or whatever. So you had a sense of terror.
Excuse me, what's happening?
We didn't really have any information to go on. So it wasn't until we got close to the school that it was apparent that this was something major.
By the time the parents reached the school, crowds of concerned residents were forming, and the world's media was already descending.
I got sent at that time across the road to a house the other side of the school. I was told to go there, and when I got there, my wife was already inside waiting. We just started to sit and wait till the parents came along, and then we suddenly realised this was all the one particular class. So we started to realise, I think, at that time that we were different to all the other families.
Eventually, somebody came in and said that the incident only concerned one class, and that was Mrs. Mayer's. And perhaps it was only then that I started getting really concerned.
Gwen Mayer had a class of 30 pupils, 5- and 6-year-olds that included Sophie and Charlotte. After the announcement, those parents concerned were taken out of the house and moved inside the school to wait for further news.
There was doctors from the surgery and some of the ministers, local ministers, but they were like everyone else. They were just generally chatting. We were just waiting and waiting. There was no information coming through.
Dunblane Primary School was one of the largest in Scotland. So there were over 600, nearly 700 pupils there. So the chances that your own child has been affected by anything are quite small. But of course, as soon as you're told that it only affects her class, then everything changes. From that point onwards, the demands for information increased. We were being told nothing, except that we would hear in 2 or 3 minutes. There was a senior police officer who'd been put in charge of us, and he kept on saying, 2 minutes, it will tell you in 2 minutes.
16 sets of parents had been ushered into a room by police, but had no information about the welfare of their children. Helplessly, they had to sit and wait for news.
And then all of a sudden, some people came into the room, read out a list of names and asked those people to move on. And obviously at that time, we didn't know, are those the people that have got bad news or is it good news?
As officers tried to deal with the scale of the incident, outside, police called for backup from other forces, as more crowds gathered, waiting for answers.
I remember standing looking back and people just rushing straight up, and terror, just terror. Everybody sensed it. There was a big emergency operation ongoing. It was terrifying. I just stood at the side entrance to the school. You could smell the fear and you could feel the fear.
Here in Dunblane, a scene of hell and damnation is how a teacher described
Police continued to allow parents some access to the building in order to collect those children not affected. Meanwhile, just yards away in the staff room, officers were giving little away.
As parents, you always need to know where your child is. And here we were, not being told anything. We had taken our children to school that morning. We had left them in the care of the school, yet we didn't know where they were. We weren't being told where they were. We weren't being told what had happened to them. I had a friend with me who I'd met up when she'd been Sophie's nursery teacher, and she very kindly said she'd stay with me until I had some news. And obviously everything was going through our heads. Is she alive? If she's alive, is she injured? Is she waiting desperately to meet up with me? Or is she dead? They were all thoughts, they were all possibilities.
As parents waited for news, Anna and her colleague tried to gather more information.
It was an eerie atmosphere, just like numb, and people coming out, kids coming out crying. There was obviously some parents there coming to get their kids out. Because I was with Alan and because he had children at the school, he was able to go through the police lines, and I went with him right into the school. I will remember for the rest of my life being struck by the cloakroom. All these wee pegs, which are only at the height of 5 and 6 year olds. But in this cloakroom was all these wee coats hanging.
A terrible set of circumstances has occurred at Dunblane Primary School this morning.
The community in Dunblane has been devastated by tragic news. Early reports tell of a shooting in the local primary school. Parents rush to their children, but are told little else, only that one class is affected. As concerned residents and the world's media descend, frantically trying to discover what has happened, affected families have been ushered into the school staff room. Mick North has waited hours for any news on his daughter, Sophie.
I sat there as patiently as possible. I probably wasn't one of those people sort of demanding immediate information. But 2 hours after I'd been there, a group of 3 people came in and called out to speak to the North family. My mind just spun through everything.
Mick, along with the other families, knew nothing about his daughter's welfare at this point. Only that a shooting had occurred and Gwen Mayer's class had been affected.
We got to the other classroom. The next thing Derek, the police officer, said was, you'll know there's been an incident, a shooting incident, in which 16 children have died.
Mrs. May's class was the class involved. There has been a shooting at the school.
That was the first time I'd heard the number 16. And it changed my thoughts on everything. Once he said there were 16, that matched the number of us who were left. So he didn't need to be telling me, which he did next, that Sophie was one of them, because I'd already worked that out very quickly. They told me Sophie's teacher had been killed and that the perpetrator was dead.
5-year-old Sophie North had just started gym class with the rest of her group when a gunman entered the school and began shooting.
It's always been very hard to recall exactly how I felt the moment that the news was confirmed. I know how I felt a few minutes later. I felt anger. I felt anger at these people I'd only just met because they told me to wait a bit longer, and I got angry and I said I'd been waiting so many hours to find out that my daughter had been killed. I wasn't going to wait any longer. They were doing it out of kindness. They were trying to arrange a car to take me home.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get angry.
Don't worry, we'll have to break the news.
I then apologised for getting angry, and then I just felt numb. I suspect the brain sort of shuts down lots of the thought processes because they're too hard at that time, and that's how numbness kicks in.
Someone came in and asked the question, is that all the parents gone? No, there's still 2 of us here. So they went away and they came back and the Ross family were taken away. So that left just myself and Barbara in this room, a room that was an hour ago pretty full. Police officers and the social worker sat us down, and that was when they just said, unfortunately, there's been a shooting, and there's no easy way to say this, your daughter's been shot. And unfortunately, she's not survived, so your daughter was dead. So that's when my world sort of fell apart. I just broke down, just cried, why?
Charlotte Dunn was in the same class as Sophie North. Both girls were murdered, along with 14 of their friends and their teacher, Gwen Mayer.
Reality started to sink in, and it was just, it was just numbing, really. It was just numbing, and disbelief, still saying no, it's not us.
Martin and Barbara were taken back to the family home.
We had to start contacting family to tell them the worst possible news that they wanted. My parents and Barbara's parents were already in transit to Scotland from the Midlands, so we took a conscious decision not to tell them until they arrived.
I got back to a house that was obviously empty, but seemed even more empty than it should have been. The answer machine was full of messages, and playing them through, you could hear the same people phoning a number of times, getting increasingly worried.
Hi Mick, it's Dave. Can you call me back? Hi Mick, it's Dave again. Can you give me a call back as soon as you get this message?
I shut myself away for the first week or so after Sophie's death. Surprisingly, for someone who reads newspapers quite avidly, watches TV news quite a lot, I just didn't want to know what was being reported.
Here in Dunblane, a scene of hell and damnation is how
As
a
the
teacher
families
described
tried
a
desperately
primary
to absorb what had happened to them, details of the massacre began to unfold.
Different to that. Yeah.
Was it in one classroom, sir?
It was in a gymnasium.
A crazed gunman had committed the most horrific crime against 16 innocent children. He was identified by police as 43-year-old unemployed former shopkeeper and scout leader Thomas Hamilton. Just a few hours earlier, he had travelled 7 miles from his house in nearby Stirling to the primary school with a premeditated plan.
He'd hired a rental van the day before, and he drove it to Dunblane and was seen parking the vehicle in the school car park at about 9:30. He then cut telephone wires. It's assumed that he thought he was cutting the wires to the school. In fact, he cut them to local houses, so the school's telephone actually still worked. He then went into the school. No one is exactly sure how he got in. Dunblane Primary School, a rambling building, lots of different entrances, but he wasn't seen going in.
The children had gone to the classroom first, and because they were doing gym immediately after assembly, they changed into their gym kit.
2 of Gwen Mayer's pupils were absent that day, so 28 boys and girls eagerly changed for their gym class and then went to assembly.
So they were in the assembly ended. They went into the gym, which is the room next door.
He went to the assembly hall. It's also assumed that he thought that the assembly would be taking place then. He'd asked a boy the week before what time the assembly took place, and the boy misinformed him and told him it was 9:30.
He obviously went into the assembly hall looking for the children. They were not there, but he heard noise in the hall, so he'd moved to the hall.
250 of the school's pupils had attended assembly that morning. Once Hamilton realised he'd missed his intended target, he fired a bullet into the stage and one into the girls' toilets nearby.
No one will know whether that was a deliberate move to go to the gym or whether it was because it just happened to be the nearest room. He then walked in. He was pointing the gun. He shot at the adults, and then he shot at the children.
Gwen Mayer, Eileen Harold and Mary Blake were just about to start their gym class with the pupils. Hamilton opened fire as soon as he entered the hall. They had no time to react.
There were 3 teachers in the gym that morning. Gwen Mayer was shot and killed immediately. The other 2 teachers were badly injured but managed to get into a storeroom, and some children who survived the shooting managed to get in there with them, and they hid in there, hoping that Hamilton wouldn't find them. He continued shooting for about 3 minutes, which must have felt like an agonisingly long time for those in the storeroom.
Although badly injured and terrified, the teachers tried desperately not to attract the gunman's attention. As Hamilton fired indiscriminately at other pupils and staff, 2 other children and a teacher in Primary 7 were injured.
At one point he actually went out of the gym, fired at a couple of other classes before coming back in, shooting again, and then finally killing himself.
The children and their teacher who were murdered received 58 gunshot wounds. A further 10 pupils were seriously wounded. Only 2 children out of the whole class escaped without injury. Head teacher Ron Taylor was the first to make a call to police after hearing gunshots and went immediately to the gym. Other members of staff, also alerted by the sound, followed to be faced with the unthinkable. Those in the storeroom, fearing for their lives, were eventually rescued by the staff and an off-duty police officer who was dropping his children at the school. The outpouring of grief over the next few days was unprecedented, as news of the mass murder rippled across the globe.
Dunblane had become the centrepiece of the world. Donations and cards started to flow in. Goodwill from all around the world was sent. The press intrusion at the time didn't really affect us because we were being guarded, but you saw people being interviewed in the street.
As the once peaceful Scottish town became the focal point of the world, the people of Dunblane demanded answers. What had driven this man to commit this horrific act of violence? And how was it allowed to happen?
Within the first evening, people knew that this guy was everybody knew his name, and people knew he was a kind of oddball character.
He'd been a scout leader who had been asked to leave the Scouts, but he had continued running boys' clubs.
Hamilton's conduct with boys in his scout group had seriously been called into question. So much so that after one particular complaint from 2 boys, the association revoked his warrant and blacklisted him. He had been with them less than a year. Despite being struck off, he tried to enter the Scouts again in a county 10 miles away. His attempt failed, so Hamilton went on to form his own boys' clubs.
There have been a lot of complaints about Thomas Hamilton over the years concerning the way he ran his boys' clubs, which some people considered too strict. But that was balanced at the time by people who were quite happy for their boys to go along to these. So there were mixed messages coming out. What was quite telling was that the number of boys who were going to the clubs was decreasing as time went on. He obviously believed that this was because rumours were being spread about him. There were attempts made to charge him over the conduct at some of the boys' camps, but charges weren't eventually brought.
Hamilton also held a firearms licence for 19 years, target shooting at least 3 gun clubs in the area.
It had all these guns and it had its licence renewed, and also there was some kind of talk that it had been reported to the police as maybe you shouldn't renew his licence, and for any guns, he had licence for loads of guns, never mind just one. So there was a question mark over did the police do the right thing here?
Hamilton's firearms licence had to be reviewed every 5 years. On each occasion, authorities allowed him to continue legally owning guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition.
On the day, he got 4 weapons with him, 4 weapons which he had licences for. He had 1,500 rounds of ammunition in a bag. Why does anyone need 1,500 rounds of ammunition in a house? Why does anyone need 4 handguns? Of varying calibers.
And as parents learnt more about Hamilton's background, further warning signs began to emerge.
We learned that at least one police officer had recommended that those guns should have been taken away from him, that he shouldn't have held a firearms licence. That recommendation was ignored by senior officers.
What happened yesterday cannot be understood.
16 innocent children and their teacher, Miss Mayer, have been murdered in a cold and calculated attack at their primary school in Dunblane, Scotland. Thomas Hamilton, a local gun enthusiast, entered the school heavily armed and opened fire on a Primary 1 class. As the families try to deal with the unimaginable pain, further light is shed on Hamilton's past.
The biggest concern about Thomas Hamilton's ownership of firearms had been when a child protection officer had been investigating a particular camp that he had run and had written to senior officers that he believed that Thomas Hamilton's behaviour at the camp made him an inappropriate person to hold firearms. He also felt that Thomas Hamilton had been devious and had not been truthful in answers he had given.
Despite numerous concerns, Hamilton continued to run his boys' clubs and retained his firearms licence. A licence that allowed him to legally possess the weapons that eventually ended the lives of so many children and their teacher.
I think there's no doubt that a lot of things could have been done. I think a bit more intelligence within Central Scotland Police Force would have prompted an attempt to take the weapons away. The broader question of firearms ownership, yes, I do think something could have been done about that as well.
Parents felt urgent changes in the gun laws needed to be made.
The Snowdrop campaign started as a petition to ban guns in this country. That was started by a group of mothers with emotion, and that rolled, and we got quite a lot of signatures.
The Snowdrop campaign attracted worldwide support. Thousands signed the petition, along with another campaign by the Sunday Mail newspaper, to completely ban legally held guns in the UK. As lobbying gathered pace, Martin and his family had another painful event to deal with.
We had made plans to move back to England because of a job move. So we'd already purchased a house in England, so we'd got a moving date. We'd got a moving date of the 29th of March. So 13th of March happened. We had a funeral to arrange. We then had a room that we'd just shut away immediately. Charlotte's bedroom had been closed up. Only myself and Barbara had been in that room since the day. And as the moving date came closer, we were forced really to go into that room and to put everything in boxes. There was tears shed, obviously, memories. You see little girls' clothes and their toys. It was all in the room, and it was a difficult time. Yeah.
Just 2 weeks after Charlotte's murder, the Dunns had to pack their daughter's possessions and move from the family home. 2 months on from the tragedy, a public inquiry opened, led by Lord Cullen, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the massacre.
The Cullen inquiry really took on board all the events of the day. It looked at legislation, etc. And certain key witnesses were called to give evidence and advice in their specialist fields. From that, Lord Cullen went away and debated what could come out of the inquiry, and there were certain recommendations made in the Cullen inquiry, which was like, a review of handgun legislation and a potential ban on handguns.
The inquiry also included shocking details from the crime scene.
We were told of Charlotte's injuries. We were told that she was shot 3 times, once through the head, once through the shoulder blade, and once out through her side. So that, although that wasn't the news we didn't really want, it also helps with closure. From there we were given little piece by piece bits of more information of what had happened on the day.
Charlotte Dunn. As parents listened to harrowing details surrounding their child's death, the urge to ban legally held guns grew. 4 months on from the tragedy, the people of Dunblane forced Parliament to listen to their plight, with over 705,000 signatures backing their appeal for a change in gun legislation.
We took boxes upon boxes of A4 paper signed to Parliament. We all went down on a coach. We started to see MPs to campaign for a ban.
These were petitions, and whether or not they were successful, they would have limited time. But it was also important to have something more permanent in place, an organisation that could put pressure on the government and politicians to make sure that safety from guns was given equal importance to any issues about the ownership of guns and using them for sport or whatever.
Mick North, along with other parents, felt a permanent organisation was needed, one that could lobby against the legal use of firearms in the UK for years to come. So the Gun Control Network was formed. This, along with the Snowdrop campaign, became a formidable force from people demanding change.
Thomas Hamilton's guns had been legally owned. His ammunition was legally owned. You couldn't think of a situation where anyone would have that amount of ammunition.
We wanted a total ban. We didn't see the need for any guns held in private ownership.
The Conservative government at the time made a compromise to look into the possible ban of legally held handguns, a move parents felt was a step in the right direction.
I can always remember the meeting with John Major. It was explained then that the best I could hope for in that political climate was a compromise where bans would be on a certain limit, the size of the gun.
Ladies and gentlemen,
as further pressure was placed on the government to turn this compromise into a reality, Lord Cullen also made 28 strong recommendations following his inquiry into the massacre, some of which focused on vital changes to police procedures.
I think a lot of the press called the police into question, and there was a lot of locals. By that time, the people had organised themselves into a group for justice for these kids. So there was a lot of political kind of aggravation going on at that time. And the police they were called to question. We'll never ever know the truth of this.
He had an history in the central region of Scotland. Whether anything could have been done about it, I don't know. He had been banned from certain venues. He had been banned from the schools in Dunblane of running clubs, so steps had been taken. He'd been reported to the police. They'd taken no action previously. Looking back, I wished obviously somebody had stepped in a lot earlier and prevented this person from doing what he did on the day.
Of the 28 recommendations put forward, the inquiry suggested more communication between police forces and more powers to question those holding a gun licence.
One area that was of particular concern to us only in retrospect was the involvement of the police, both in the licensing of Thomas Hamilton's firearms and also in their conduct on the day. I sat through a lot of evidence at the Cullen inquiry. I learnt a lot of things, most of which I don't think I'd have ever wanted to know about firearms legislation. And nothing I heard convinced me that it was safe for most people to have ownership of something as dangerous as handguns. That's not to say that any individual person would not be okay with them. It's just that the risk of having so many of these weapons in the hands of so many people was just not worth it.
14 months after the Dunblane massacre, a change in legislation was finally introduced.
The first Firearms Amendment Act, which banned the larger caliber handguns, came in about a year after the Dunblane shootings. The second act, which banned the smaller caliber handguns, became law later on in 1997. So that's 18 months or so from the awful events at Dunblane to getting a ban on the private ownership of handguns.
They just showed people how you can recover and you can make changes to the law for other people. And I just thought that they showed tremendous courage, the people who were behind that campaign.
Britain's been a safer place since the handgun ban has been in. And it was a ban on legally owned weapons, not illegally owned weapons. That was always the argument over what about the illegal weapons? And, well, they are illegal, so there are laws for that.
It's quite clear that in recent years, gun crime has been falling steadily. The risk of them happening has been considerably reduced.
The change in law was a significant milestone. But despite this, parents were left to form their own conclusions about Hamilton's motives.
Any attempt to explain what was going on in Thomas Hamilton's mind can only be a guess. Some good guessing perhaps went on at the inquiry by clinical psychiatrists, clinical psychologists. He had financial problems. He didn't like what he felt was being said about him in Dunblane and elsewhere. He didn't like the fact that his boys' club had been far less successful. And it's clear from other things he had said over the years that he was someone who liked to blame others for his failures.
Hamilton clearly had issues. The inquiry revealed that a week before the tragedy, he had written a letter to the Queen complaining he'd been branded a pervert and protesting his innocence.
Why Dunblane Primary School? Why that day? No one's ever going to know. It does, in a way, fit a pattern of mass killing. Someone who wants to kill themselves is aggrieved at how they feel other people have treated them, and so make sure that other people suffer at the same time as they kill themselves. But again, that's speculating on exactly why he wanted to do it.
Was it a revenge attack? You know, were we chosen against all the other towns that he'd had clubs in? And we'll never really know, I'd say, because he took his own life. He took a coward's way out. But in some respects, I think that's better for us, because I don't know how I'd react if he was still alive in a prison.
The horrific events of March the 13th, 1996, will be etched into people's minds forever. No one will ever know the full reason why 16 innocent children and their teacher were brutally murdered. Shortly after the new legislation was passed, Mick North decided to leave Dunblane.
I had to retire a year or so afterwards because my health wasn't good enough to continue working. I had no reason to stay in Dunblane after it happened, and since I had the option of moving away, I did.
As Mick North left Dunblane, Martin Dunn and his family decided to return.
We'd been back in England for a while. Myself and Barbara had been coming backwards and forwards to Scotland, so we could go to the cemetery every now and then. We decided that being away in England was not working for us, so eventually we made plans and we came back to Scotland. We've been here ever since, and for us that was the right decision.
The community of Dunblane has tried hard to move on from the tragedy. Shortly after the mass murder, the gymnasium at the primary school was demolished. But for those who witnessed the horrors of that day, nothing will erase the painful memories.
Life had changed for all these other children as well, because children who have witnessed something, who have got that as a memory. I mean, no child should have to see that, and they have that as a memory. If you ask someone to talk about their childhood, these children have that as a memory, that day and that week and those kids that they lost.
Go on, press Debbie. Go on, carry on.
The loss doesn't go away. As the years go on, it becomes a bit more acceptable, but the raw pain on some days just doesn't go away. You drive past the school and see children running around in the playground and you think, oh, that could have been Charlotte. We couldn't go to a wedding for a long, long time because I hadn't got a daughter to give away anymore.
There's always a huge hole there, and that's never ever going to go away, no matter what I do.
We'd have loved her whichever way she would have turned out, but we'll never know. There are those memories and reminders there that trigger those what-ifs.
It would be very hard to say exactly how much I miss Sophie. I can think of so many wonderful things that we could have done over the years.
Get upset. We have good memories. We remember things that we did as a family. sledging down the hill with a granddad. Over the years we've come to learn to cope with those bad days, and the good days are there to remind us of the good times.
I don't know how well I would have dealt with a teenage girl on my own. However, I would have loved the chance to find out.